Hi class, it's Bill Berry here with another intro to a chapter, and this one it's chapter 8, a chapter that tells you more about what you can do with strings. You've already covered this in some detail along the way, right? We've used strings as input, we've done some minor manipulation with them, etc. But this chapter talks about more exciting things that you can do. I don't know how many times over the years I've written programs to do some sort of processing that required string manipulation. You get a file that has contents in one format and the user needs it to be in another format. You get it with comma delimited, but you need to do something else with it and display it in some other way. So programming very often talks to and requires string manipulation, and Python makes it pretty darn easy. And I think you'll see after this chapter why Python is used so often for this kind of stuff. There's so many functions that make it easy and so many facilities that you'll find just make string manipulation so great. So let's jump in. I cannot possibly cover everything that's in this chapter. There's a lot of lists and tables, so I can't possibly cover all those, but I want to give you the flavor of the main topics here and give you some straightforward examples and get you started. So let's go. So we'll talk about some very basic stuff that you can do with strings, like iterating through them, indexing them to get characters, and how to smush them or concatenate them together to make other strings. We'll talk about a special facility in Python called string slicing that makes it very easy to grab out pieces of a string and return them. And then we'll talk about some of the functions that Python has to test strings for certain things. You can search in them and you can manipulate them in some other ways. Again, not exhaustive, but at least a good introduction of the breadth of topics here. And I'll refer you to certain pages that you may want to put stickies on because they're going to be very useful in string manipulation in the future. So very first thing, Python lets you go through a string very easily. You may have seen this, I've used it in a previous example, but if you want to go through each character in a string, you can very easily do it with a for loop, and you say for, make up a variable name like char, and then say in and put the name of the string. And then anything that you do inside of that loop will happen for each character in the string, and you can use the loop variable char if you want to access each particular element to test it or do some other manipulation on it. So very easy to iterate over a string using a for loop. Not many languages make it that easy, so this is cool. Second topic here is indexing, and that is that you can get to a specific character by referring to its position in the string in square brackets. Now, the thing to remember here is programming languages tend to think of things in a base 0 world, not a base 1 world. So the first character in the string is actually character 0, not character 1. So remember that if you want to work on these indexes, you've got to think a little bit. The other thing is, because of that same deal, if you look at the last character, you can't use length and use that as an index to the last character because that's past the end. If a string is 5 digits long, its valid indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, not 5. So you've got to subtract 1 if you want to use length. You've got to use length minus 1, and that'll get you the last character here. And last major topic on this page, concatenation. If you want to take strings and put them together to compose other strings, you just want to sort of smush one string on after another, concatenation is really easy. You use the plus operator, and plus means string concatenation. And so you can create a whole name, like this example here, by taking the first name and then smushing on a space and then smushing on the last name. So whole name will contain the whole entire name, all three pieces that you put together there. So that's some very basic string things that you need to know in order to get started. It's also fairly common to want to grab out pieces of a string. Now, I've done some very basic examples here. The thing that's missing is I'm using a specific example with specific indexes, but very often you're going to need to go find those. So topics later in the slide deck will talk about how you go find something that you want to do. So very often these examples, instead of having hard-coded zeros and fives and things like that, are going to have variables where you have looked things up and you know where to find them in the string. But that set aside, Python gives this very, very nice way to pull apart strings based on some positions. And so the general form of this is you put the string and then in square brackets again, you put the starting index and then a colon and the ending index. The key that you need to look at here is the colon piece, because colon says I'm doing a slice of a string. Because the interesting piece here is the starting index and the ending index are optional. You don't have to do them, as you'll see in examples below. Also, there's another way that you can use this where you give a step value. We'll do that as another example at the end. So let's say that you have the variable username, and in that you have stored the string Chris space Jones. So let's look at various ways we can slice that. The first example says username puts only a colon in the square brackets. You don't have a start or an end. Well, if you specify neither a start or an end, you get the whole string, right? Since you sort of haven't specified. So that's how that works. Second example is you say username square bracket 0 colon 5. That says I want starting at position 0 everything up to but not including the thing at position 5. So that's going to be position 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which happens to be 5 letters, and that will return the word Chris. Interesting, stop and think about that, not including, right? Up to but not including. Next one example is I put 6 colon, but I don't put an ending value. That says I want to start at position 6, but I just want whatever else, right? Give me the whole rest of the string. So that's going to bring out Jones because that's 6 through whatever. Now you can also leave out the first parameter, so the first start of the slice, so you can say username square bracket, and then in this case colon 5 says, hey, I just want to start from the beginning and go to everything up to but not including index 5. So once again, this brings out just the word Chris. Now in the last example, I wanted to show you, you don't have to use a variable here. You can use a string literal like A, B, C, D, E. And this uses this second form that I talked about at the top. So I'm saying A, B, C, D, E, and then I'm going to slice it apart. I want to start at position 0 up to but not including position 5. And then I put this other thing after another colon. That's the step value. That says I want every second character or every other character. So in this case, this returns the value ACE, A-C-E. That's pretty cool. Now, one thing you might think about here is on the previous slide, I told you very carefully, don't use an index of length, right? You have to go 1 minus to be careful you don't go off the end of the string. But here, notice we're using this quite often. I'm using an index of 5 here, even though it only has 5 characters, so that's 0 through 4 positions. 5 should be invalid. Well, in slicing, it goes up to but not including that index. So if you want everything to the end, you have to use 1 greater. And in fact, it's very forgiving here. I can put, instead of the 5 on this last row, I can put 352. And it just doesn't care, right? It'll do everything up to that and go, oh yeah, okay, we went off the end, no big deal. So slicing is very forgiving in terms of using the indexes. So really cool thing, string slicing. And again, very often you're going to do some searching before you know where you want to slice it apart. So very often these are variables instead of hard-coded numbers like 0 and 1, or 0 and 5 and 6, things like that. But very cool, very powerful. All right, next example is testing and searching and manipulating. There's so many things that you want to do with strings that Python makes very easy. There's a bunch of good tables in your books, so I'll refer to where you can find that table. But first of all, let's talk about an easy one where if you want to find out whether one string is in another string, you can use the in word, or you can use not in. So those 2 keywords will let you search in a string and say whether it's present or not. So they return a Boolean result. So I can say if apostrophe E, so if the literal E is in username anywhere. Now it doesn't have to be a single character, it can be a whole string. But in this case, if E is in username, I can print, hey, your name contains an E. You could also look for something larger like hello, if hello in user message or whatever. So next topic, before we move on to the next topic, one of the things that's very important to get in your brain is all of these string functions work on strings, but strings are, in programming terminology, immutable. The immutable part means when you manipulate strings through their methods, it doesn't act on the strings. They always return a new string which you have to go do something with. So you'll see an example later that I'll call this out on, but you always when you call these things, you're going to have some variable on the left-hand side of an equal, an assignment typically, where you're going to save the new string that's been manipulated or modified in some way. So let's jump in and talk about some of these important methods. First is you have a whole bunch of methods, and there's a nice table on page 352. You might put a sticky here. And these are things like, is it an alphanumeric character? Is it an alphabetic? Is it a digit? Is it lowercase? Is it uppercase? Is it a space? And all of these will test a particular string, or in this case a character would work as well, and say whether that is true for that character. So in this particular example at the bottom here, you'll see that I have a variable, a Boolean variable called has space. I set it to false. And then I loop through a user's name using char as the loop variable. And I say if char dot is space, and then of course it's a function, so it needs parentheses. So this says, hey, if that thing is a space, then I set the variable has space to true, and after we get out of the loop I can say, hey, the username has at least one space in it if that has space variable is now true. So you'll notice that this is the typical form for these, which is you put the name of the string, and then you put a dot, and then you put the function with parentheses afterwards. This is a method, and strings here are acting like an object. So this is a bunch of really cool methods you can test for uppercase, lowercase, alphabetic, all that kind of stuff. Look at that table and do some examples and read your book, but I think those will make sense to you. All right, the next one we're going to look at is there's a series of modification methods, and again, another table, this is on page 354, that returns the string with those changes that you want having been made to it. So in this case, let's start with username being space, 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 John Doe, space, 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 \n, where John Doe has a bunch of extra white space. This can be tabs, new lines, spaces, things like that. And then one of the many methods that's useful here is one called strip. Now there's some strip types that use just stripping from the left, another command that strips from the right. So methods to do several of those things, but in this case I'm using the generic strip. And that says, hey, strip off leading and following white spaces. It does that, but then notice on the left I have username equals. Right? It would be a very typical error for you to forget to put username equals, thinking that the stripping happens in place in the same variable. It does not. So you got to say username equals username.strip, and then it saves it back in that same variable username. Got it? All right. Next, there are a bunch of methods that help with search and replace. So if you want to find where in a string a particular thing happens, you can do that. Again, nice table on 355. So let's use a very typical one called find. So you'll notice in this example, we start with a username of John * Doe. We'll use that in a minute. And then to find out where Doe starts within the name, we say position, a variable, equals username.find, and then in the parentheses, the parameter it requires is what you want to find. So it says look in this string, username, and see if you can find the word Doe in that. If it can, it'll return what position it found it at. If it doesn't find it, it'll return a -1. So you have to use that, understand that that's a signal to you that it didn't find it. So in this case, we can say then after it does that find, we can say if position is greater than -1, it must be a valid spot. Then we can print out, hey, the username does indeed contain Doe. Now using that same string of username John * Doe, you can do a replace command. The replace method says username dot replace, and then the inside the parentheses, the parameters, the first one is what you want to replace, and the second one is what you want to replace it with. So in this case, we want to replace all occurrences of an asterisk, a single character. Again, you could use a string. We want to replace all of those with a space. So replace all asterisks with a space, and then again we want to store it back in the username having stripped off those asterisks. And then we print the username, of course, now we're to John * which is what we wanted. So again, very powerful, easy to manipulate strings. Just don't forget to store them back in another variable when you're done. Last item for this particular one, you can multiply Strings, you can generate repetitions by using an asterisk as if you were multiplying them. So for instance, to generate a bunch of hyphens, I can use a hyphen character and then say times or multiply asterisk 60. So that'll generate 60 of those or hyphens, and it will store it back in the bunch of hyphens variable. The last example on the page says I want to print this string times 3, right? Multiplied by 3, repeated 3 times. So in this case, I'm going to get oh my, oh my, oh my. It's going to do it 3 times. So this is hardly a taste of these, but at least a taste of the kinds of things that you can do and some examples. Read your book. You're going to see a lot more examples, and look at those tables for lots of different ways. Mark them with stickies, as I said. Okay, last topic that's going to be an interesting one for you is there are many times, and again, over the years, I don't know how many times I've done this, written programs to pull apart data and put it back together some other way. Very often when you get these strings in, they come in delimited somehow. Like you can get maybe a whole bunch of fields together with a percent sign between them or some other special character, or maybe you just get a bunch of names with spaces in between them. But you're forever in programming taking these things apart and looking for the next string and pulling off the next little text and stuff like that. So Python allows you to do this super cool, super easy way to break strings up into fields in this one easy way. And the example of the command that you use is the method here is called split. Now, by default, it's going to split things at spaces. So for instance, if you type in a series of 5 words, a user types in a sentence, you can split it up into individual strings representing each word, and it's very straightforward. But let's look at a different example here. So using this example at the top of Dana Wong and this whole record where we have name, account, balance, and phone, if that's stored in a variable called field list, I can say field list, or sorry, it's stored in a variable called input line. So we make up this new thing, this new variable called field list. This is going to be a list type variable, which you may not fully understand because we haven't studied that chapter yet, but just bear with me and I think you'll see the general idea. So we make up a variable, we say equals, then we take the data here, Dana Wong's record, input line, and then say dot split, and the parameter we want here is that we want the separator, the delimiter at which it's going to split it, to be the percent sign because that's what's used in the data above. Now what it's going to return is actually a list data structure. Right? This would be an array in some programming languages or a list in Python. Now again, we're going to study this more in detail, but all you need to know now is that you can index that list, and each index will point to one of the strings that it pulled out after it split it apart at the percent signs. So if we looked at field list bracket 0, that would have Dana Wong in it. Field list 1 would have 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and all 4 fields would be broken out. So you'll understand this a little bit better once we look at the field or the list chapter, but I think this is not that hard to understand. It's a neat idea of what it does, and then we'll understand more details a little later. So Python is incredibly powerful when it comes to manipulating strings. So many different functions, so many different useful items here. So I hope you have fun with this chapter and the exercises that go with it. As always, post in the forum or send me email if you want more information about something, and I will be glad to clarify. Thanks for watching the video.